Welcome to St Paul's Knightsbridge on this Wednesday evening. William Walton's Jubilate Deo establishes our theme for another Wednesday evening provocation. The COVID pandemic has sparked a vigorous debate for many organisations about how to weather the financial storm, and within the church, one simple response is to keep churches closed, centralised streaming services so that we can all watch online. And of course, another big saving lots of churches are thinking is to scrap music making. Already here in London, St Margaret's, Westminster and Holy Trinity Sloane Street have done just that. Does it matter? Does live music making in churches make any difference? The psalmist in the Jubilate says, "Come into God's presence with a song." St Augustine says, "He who sings prays twice." So shall we begin by singing together in the words of George Herbert's great poem, "Let all the world in every corner sing."
A reading from the letter to the Colossians. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. This is the word of the Lord.
Gardenia Griffith there, reading one of the loveliest passages from St Paul's letters. And when you analyse it, painting a picture of what a harmonious parish should look and feel like, people working at reconciliation, being rooted in Christian living, in peace, focused on God, offering worship with gratitude in their hearts. And I love that detail, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. I joined a Zoom call yesterday with most of the clergy of the two cities area of the diocese, that's the central part of London, convened by our Archdeacon, to hear a short paper about the current situation in our churches in respect of music making, and to hear my fellow clergy raise questions and voice anxieties. It was a good and useful meeting, and good to be able to share with one another. One thing, though, that struck me about the tone of the conversation, beyond the palpable anxiety and exhaustion that was evident in the faces of all those clergy peering out into the Zoom meeting from their studies, churches, homes and offices across our city, was that in our anxiety it felt really hard to get very far beyond a very functional and practical conversation about music making in churches, informed by cost-saving, proper process, where rules have to change or cease, and the evolving regulations and guidance from church and government about perspex screens and solo singers and blown instruments that tell us what we can and can't currently do. And on a positive note, some discussion about possible efficiencies and sharing in the future. And of course, these are all important considerations and inevitable concerns in such days as these. Some parishes, indeed many parishes and even dioceses across the nation, are staring into the financial abyss and fearfully wondering what will have to change if they are not to face extinction. And so never more so than now, spreadsheets, cash projections, general finances really matter. But I wonder if perhaps in such days as these, we risk falling into thinking not as priests, theologians and custodians of Christian community, but as budget holders and church managers. And this is not an invitation to do anything less than be ruthlessly financially prudent and pragmatic, but simply a reminder that when we think about financial commitments in our churches, we need to think about the bottom line, yes, but about other things too. Our bishop reminded us last week in a letter that although patterns of Christian music making vary between town and country, between cities, and though cathedrals and some of our university cities have a huge and vital role, it is the parish churches in many larger provincial cities, but perhaps most especially here in central London, that have tended to be those sustaining professional church music making, that is, having paid quartets or octets or more, paid directors of music and their assistants, and who have traditionally offered scholarships, organ scholarships and choral scholarships by way of apprenticeships. COVID's unintended consequence is that we have to stop and think about something we have in many places simply taken for granted and assume that it will always be there. And this is not a question we can put off, nor is it an abstract theoretical question anymore, because already in our city in recent weeks, two major churches, St Margaret's Westminster and Holy Trinity Sloane Street, as I said earlier, have axed, suspended or wound up their musical establishments, and there is real anxiety among professional church musicians and some clergy. So here's the exam question. Should we simply cut our costs and save money by ditching our musical tradition, saving in our case tens of thousands of pounds a year, or should we retain our musical tradition, and if the latter, why? This is Nicholas Temperley, who died on the 8th of April this year, a renowned musicologist and academic who in 1979 published a magisterial 2-volume survey entitled The Music of the English Parish Church. It's such an important study because tracing the history of church music right back to the medieval period, Temperley reminds the world that the parish churches and not only the cathedrals have played and continue to play a huge role in supporting music making in communities and to the glory of God. Down through the Christian centuries, the way that's been done has changed from a cappella music to the introduction of organs to accompany singing, instrumental bands and consorts in West End galleries, triumphing, well, discuss that, in the late Victorian ideal of surplus cathedral-style choirs in every parish church chancel in the land. As with many things, what the Victorians gave us proves to be something of a millstone around our neck as a church, but we shouldn't fail to be unendingly thankful for this unfolding tradition over the centuries and for the part parish churches and not only cathedrals and royal chapels have played in it. And Temperley touches on the question of cost. None of this has ever been cheap and easy, but read his survey and you will see unveiled a rich tradition of which we are just the last part in a centuries-long process of development. Within that tradition, there has been a consistent tension between artistic performance at one extreme, that is the offering of the very highest quality of music in churches, often utilizing the skills of highly trained singers and players, And at the other end, popular involvement with congregational singing, but that has developed into a unique corpus in England of congregational hymns, popular settings, verse anthems, varied choral music, organ and instrumental music. So yes, we could cut our losses, and yes, this is the subject for another evening's provocation, we could all go congregational and dispense with choirs and professional musicians. And of course, since the 1960s, since Vatican II, that wave of instinct has been felt in the church. It's important to involve people in music making. But I think that there are 4 strong arguments why we shouldn't abandon the music we have and why we should stand against any tide of cutting back, even if it's a struggle to resist. And they are these. First, I notice that clergy and others quickly fall into them and us conversations when we talk about professional musicians in a parish setting. And yes, it's true, we pay them to sing, but there is no them and us. There is only our common endeavour. Every parish is a rich ecosystem consisting not only of clergy and congregation, but of everyone who's involved. And this ecosystem is far wider than just what we see on Sunday mornings, because we have to remember that with musicians come composers and choral societies involved with parish churches and local festivals. And all of these things, if we cut our music, we will risk destroying or undermining. So it's not just about what we pay for, it's much more than that. The second argument is similar. It's about paying musicians, but it's also about recognizing that in fact they are vocational creatures. Few musicians, if any, pursue music making to make a fortune. On the contrary, like clergy, they go into it because they feel called, they love it, and because when they are doing what they love, they feel most fully alive. And amateur and professional church musicians are specialists in a particular language and a particular idiom. Clergy do not have a monopoly on notions of vocation. And as a church, we should foster all vocational living and do everything we can to support it. Our musicians are at present some of the most vulnerable people in our society because they fall between stools when it comes to the support being offered. We should support them now, and we should cherish their vocations in the future. The third reason has to do with this tradition. Traditio means handing on. And through our sponsorship of music and church musicians, we are developing new singers, young artists, the singers and organists of the future. And we are providing space in which new music is commissioned and performed and new skills developed. Do we really want, through lack of imagination, to break with this carefully nurtured tradition over so many centuries and instead rely on CDs, piped music, or in unimaginative and inelegant congregational music? The fourth, and for now the final reason that seems important to rehearse, has to do with something a number of colleagues, I'm sure unwittingly, fell into saying yesterday, and that was to suggest that since congregations have thinned, some are down by 2/3 on what they were, there just, quotes, aren't the people to justify the investment in professional music making. But the point is surely this, that a congregation isn't an audience, however lovely it may be to come along and hear fine music on a Sunday morning. A congregation is a group gathered to worship God. And the music we make, therefore, is not primarily for us, but is offered to God. That is what St. Paul is on about in the letter to the Colossians. Our calling is to offer worship with gratitude in our hearts, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and offering to God the very best of what we have. Closing thoughts and prayers in a moment, but that seems the perfect cue for this fine hymn. You know, we're all rightly worried about the financial impact of COVID on our churches. Of course, we're all going to have to cut our cloth accordingly as we go forward, and who knows yet what that may mean. Certainly some communities and parishes will have to do things very differently, and that may be immensely positive. It may equally mean that in some places what we've been used to will have to stop, and parishes may merge. We will have to wind things up and transform ourselves. Many churches will cease to be primarily places with a Sunday focus and will become centres for social impact from Monday to Saturday. But as we begin shaping our response to the future, we should not forget the special calling and place that our parish churches have, and we should maintain our commitment to music making, because it is for the glory of God. It is part of the fabric of our nation, and it is something that we could so easily destroy and undermine. And I hope that as we go forward, that you will be prepared to be as bold and generous as you have been as we sustain the future.